I walked through my own front door, still smelling like the champagne my unit had poured over my new Silver Eagle Colonel now, after 22 years, and my daughter's small hand warm in mine. I expected to find my husband waiting with pride in his eyes. Instead, I found divorce papers fanned across the kitchen island like a hand of cards. Someone had already decided to win my husband standing beside a woman I didn't recognize, and the word soldier thrown at me like an insult instead of the title I'd bled for. I didn't cry. I smiled. Because they had no idea whose house they were standing in. The ceremony that morning had been simple, the way the army does things when it matters most. No fireworks, just a room full of people who understood exactly what the new rank on my shoulders had cost me. 22 years of deployments, of missed birthdays, and reheated Thanksgiving dinners, of learning to sleep through mortar fire, and then worse, learning to sleep through silence when I came home, and the house felt too quiet. Colonel. 06. My commanding general pinned the eagle himself and shook my hand a beat longer than protocol required. Elizabeth, he said, you earned every bit of this the hard way. I thanked him, and I meant it, but the truth is my mind had already left the room. I was thinking about Daniel, about how his face would look when I told him, about Emily jumping up and down in that ridiculous way she does when she's proud of someone she loves. I didn't tell my colleagues that the person I most wanted to see wasn't in that room. That's not something you say out loud in front of men who've just watched you get promoted past some of them. So I kept it inside, folded up neat the way I fold everything that matters too much to risk saying wrong. I picked Emily up from school at 3:15, same as always, except this time I was still in uniform, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar with its new insignia. She spotted me through the chain-link fence before I'd even parked, and she came running with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, blonde ponytail flying loose from its elastic. "Mommy, you look different," she said, breathless, studying the eagle on my collar like it was a puzzle. "Is that new?" "It's new," I told her, crouching down to her height. "Guess what it means?" Her eyes went wide when I explained it. Colonel, the highest rank I'd ever imagined reaching when I was 18 and signing enlistment papers against my own mother's wishes. Emily didn't fully understand military hierarchy, but she understood pride. She understood that her mother had done something big. "We have to celebrate," she announced already, tugging my hand toward the car. "Can we get the little cakes, the ones with the strawberries?" We stopped at the bakery on Maple Street, the one that's been there since before Emily was born, and we picked out 2 small cakes with strawberries pressed into white frosting. Emily carried the box on her lap the whole ride home, careful as a bomb technician narrating what she imagined Daniel's reaction would be. "Daddy will be so proud of you," she said more than once, like she was trying the sentence on for size. "He's going to say you're the toughest mom in America." I smiled and let her believe it, because at that point I still believed it too. Whatever had gone cold between Daniel and me over the last year, the late nights he explained away the phone he'd started angling from view, the distance that had crept into our marriage like weather you don't notice until you're already soaked, I still thought foolishly that this would matter to him. That 22 years of service culminating in this would be something he'd want to celebrate with me. We pulled into the driveway a little after 5. The porch light was already on, which struck me as strange in the daylight, and there was a car I didn't recognize parked at the curb, sleek white dealer plates still on it. Emily didn't notice any of that. She was already unbuckling her self-cake box, balanced carefully, chattering about how we should light candles even though it wasn't a birthday. I noticed. I always notice. 2 decades of reading rooms before I walk into them doesn't switch off just because I'm home. Daniel was standing in the doorway before I'd even gotten my key out, and beside him was a woman in a fitted blazer. Dark hair pulled back, an expression on her face like she'd been rehearsing this moment and was pleased with how it was going. On the kitchen island behind them, visible through the open door, sat a manila folder, thick enough that I recognized what it was before anyone said a word. "Elizabeth," Daniel said. No hello. No mention of the eagle on my collar, which he had to have noticed. He wasn't stupid, whatever else he was. "This marriage is over." Emily's grip on my hand tightened. I felt it before I processed his words, that small squeeze her body, understanding something was wrong before her mind caught up. The woman beside him, Vanessa, though I didn't have her name yet, looked me up and down with something between amusement and contempt, the way you'd assess furniture you were about to have hauled away. "Pack your bags, soldier," she said, and smiled like she'd been waiting all day to say it. I could have argued. I could have asked questions, demanded explanations, given them the scene they were clearly braced for. Instead, I looked past both of them, past the folder on the counter, past 20 years of memory stacked in every room of that house. And something in me went very still and very calm, the same stillness I'd learned in briefings where the wrong reaction could cost lives. "Okay," I said quietly. Vanessa's smile faltered just slightly. "What's so funny?" I looked at her, at Daniel, at the home they thought they were standing in the middle of, claiming ownership of things they didn't understand. "Actually," I said, my voice even almost gentle, "this house belongs to—" Daniel laughed before I could finish a short, dismissive bark of a sound, cutting me off like my sentence wasn't worth completing. He had no idea he'd just made the last mistake of his marriage. Daniel's laugh hung in the air a moment too long before he straightened up and reclaimed the floor the way he always did when he wanted a room to remember who was in charge of it. "The house is mine after the divorce," he said, flat and certain, like he was reading terms off a contract he'd already signed in his head. "You can take your things and go, Elizabeth. I'll be reasonable about the furniture." Vanessa didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped past him into the front hall and began walking the house like she already owned it, fingertips trailing along the banister, pausing at the entrance to the living room to judge the paint color, the placement of the bookshelves, the framed photo of Emily's first day of kindergarten sitting on the mantel. I watched her study my home the way a realtor studies a listing, and something in me, some old, disciplined part that had learned patience in places far more dangerous than this kitchen, decided to let her keep walking. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I took Emily's hand and led her upstairs instead, away from the noise, and helped her gather a few things into her backpack, her favorite stuffed rabbit, a sweater the drawing she'd made in art class that she wasn't finished being proud of. She was quiet the whole time, watching my face for cues on how worried she should be, and I kept my expression steady because that's the one thing I could still control. "Are we leaving, Mommy?" she whispered. "Just for tonight," I told her, which was true, though not in the way she imagined. Before we left, I went to the small fireproof safe bolted inside my closet floor, the one Daniel had never once asked about in 11 years of marriage, and I removed a thin folder I'd kept there since long before he and I had said our vows. Daniel, watching from the hallway, assumed it was something to do with our joint accounts, some scramble to protect shared assets. He didn't ask. He just watched me with the smug patience of a man who thought he'd already won. I didn't correct him. I walked downstairs, set my house key gently on the counter beside the divorce papers, and looked at both of them one last time. "Enjoy your evening," I said, and meant it more than they understood. Emily and I checked into a hotel near the base that night. She fell asleep faster than I expected, exhausted from a day that had scrambled every expectation she'd walked into, and I lay awake beside her a long time. Not out of grief, but out of something closer to clarity. 22 years of service teaches you to separate emotion from action, grieve later, move now. So I didn't cry for my marriage that night. I made phone calls. Back at the house, Daniel and Vanessa were celebrating like the war was already over. I heard about it later secondhand, the way these things always surface. A bottle of champagne opened in my kitchen. Toasts, made to a future neither of them had any legal claim to. Vanessa had reportedly already started talking about paint colors for the guest room, about which of her furniture would replace mine. Daniel, riding the high of feeling like he'd finally outmaneuvered the wife he'd grown tired of being married to, let her dream out loud without correction. Neither of them knew that dream had an expiration date measured in hours. The next morning, a process server arrived at the house at 9 o'clock sharp. I know this because I'd arranged the timing myself the night before, one of several calls I'd made from that hotel room while Emily slept. Daniel answered the door in his robe, coffee in hand, probably expecting a package. Instead, he was handed a legal notice, and I imagine, though I wasn't there to see it, that his face went through several stages before landing on confusion. The notice was simple 3 pages, prepared by an attorney I'd retained years earlier for exactly this kind of contingency, though I'd hoped never to need it. It stated in plain and uncontestable legal language that the house at 214 Ashford Lane was titled solely in my name, that it had been purchased and fully paid for before Daniel and I were married, that under the laws of our state it did not constitute marital property and was therefore not subject to division in any divorce proceeding. Daniel called me 11 times before noon. I didn't answer any of them. Some conversations are better had in a courtroom where the facts speak instead of the feelings. By early afternoon, according to what Emily's babysitter told me later, she'd stopped by to drop off a forgotten homework folder. Vanessa had read the notice over Daniel's shoulder and gone very pale, then very loud. "Impossible!" she was reported to have said, snatching the papers from his hands like she could argue with a title deed simply by refusing to accept it. "This has to be a mistake." It wasn't a mistake. It was 11 years of quiet decisions Daniel had never bothered to ask about, arriving all at once at the worst possible moment for the two people who'd assumed my absence meant my ignorance. By the time I finally returned Daniel's calls, 2 days had passed and his voice had lost every trace of the confidence he'd worn like armor in our kitchen. He'd hired his own attorney by then, a sharp young man named Curtis, who specialized, according to his website, in aggressive asset recovery. Curtis had reviewed the title documents, the notarized dates, the bank records showing the down payment had cleared a full 8 months before Daniel and I exchanged vows at the courthouse. He told Daniel in the careful language lawyers use when they're delivering bad news to a client who doesn't want to hear it that the paperwork was airtight. There was nothing to contest. That was the moment Daniel finally understood something he should have learned years earlier. I had never once, in 11 years of marriage, hidden anything from him. He simply hadn't paid attention. The truth came out slowly over the following days, not because I was withholding it, but because Daniel had never asked the right questions when it mattered. Years before we met, back when I was a captain stationed overseas, I'd used my deployment bonuses and a disciplined habit of saving nearly everything I earned to buy a modest 3-bedroom house through an estate sale back when the market in that neighborhood was still affordable and nobody was competing for it. It had been my safety net long before Daniel came into my life, my quiet insurance policy against a world that doesn't always treat single women in uniform kindly. When Daniel and I married and eventually moved into that same house together, he simply assumed, because I never corrected him, and because he never asked, that it had been purchased jointly the way most married couples buy their homes. I let him believe it, because it never occurred to me that the truth would someday matter this much. Daniel tried calling me 17 times over 3 days. I finally answered on the 4th, mostly because Emily kept asking why Daddy sounded so upset on the voicemails she wasn't supposed to be listening to. "You let me think it was ours," he said. And there was real anger in his voice, though I noted he didn't apologize for the divorce papers, or for Vanessa, or for however many months this had been building before I walked in holding my daughter's hand and a cake box. "You never asked whose name was on the deed," Daniel and I said. "In 11 years, you never once asked." He didn't have an answer for that because there wasn't one. Some truths are only uncomfortable once you realize how long you avoided looking at them. Vanessa's patience, meanwhile, was fraying fast. She'd moved several boxes of her belongings into the house that first celebratory night, so certain of her new address that she'd barely waited for the ink to dry on anything. Now those boxes sat in the garage unpacked, while she and Daniel argued in tones the neighbors could apparently hear through open windows. She had, according to what I later pieced together, believed Daniel's assurances completely that he was a successful real estate executive, that the house was a shared asset, that marrying into money meant marrying into security. She had not planned for a scenario where the boring army wife, as she'd apparently called me to a mutual acquaintance, turned out to hold every card in the deck. Emily, for her part, was handling the upheaval with more grace than either adult in this story. She'd started calling the hotel room our little apartment, and had arranged her stuffed animals along the windowsill like she was settling in for an extended stay. When Daniel called to arrange a visit, she took the phone from me with a seriousness that broke my heart a little. "I don't want to go stay with you right now," she told him, her voice small but steady. "I want to stay with Mom." I heard him try to argue gently at first, then with more urgency, but Emily held her ground the way she'd watched me hold mine, politely, calmly, without raising her voice, but without budging either. When she handed the phone back to me, Her chin was lifted in a way that reminded me so much of myself at that age, that it nearly undid the composure I'd been so carefully maintaining. Daniel's last call that week wasn't about Emily, or about reconciliation, or even about the house directly. It was about control, and the slow dawning realization that he had none left. He'd built his sense of authority in our marriage on assumptions that I was too busy, too deployed, too absorbed in my career to notice the details of our shared life. He'd never imagined that the woman he considered too plain, too rigid, too military to be interesting, had spent years quietly building a foundation he knew nothing about. "You've been planning this," he said finally, and I could hear something close to fear underneath the accusation. "No, Daniel." I told him, and for the first time in days, I let a little of what I actually felt into my voice. "I've just always paid attention to my own life. You should try it sometime." I hung up before he could respond. Some conversations end better in silence than in argument. The house was only the beginning. 2 weeks into the separation, Daniel discovered something that unsettled him more than the deed ever had. Our joint checking account, the one we'd used for years to cover groceries, utilities, and Emily's school expenses, held barely enough to cover a month of bills. He called me in a tone somewhere between accusation and panic, demanding to know where our money had gone, as if I'd quietly siphoned it away in the night. I hadn't taken anything. That was the part he couldn't seem to grasp. The joint account had always been exactly what it sounded like, a shared account for shared everyday expenses. It had never been where my real savings lived. Daniel had simply never asked where the rest of my income went, and I had never volunteered it, partly out of habit, partly because a career spent managing logistics for classified operations teaches you to keep information compartmentalized even at home. He'd been depositing his salary and drawing from that same joint account for household costs for over a decade, assuming it represented the full picture of our finances. It never had. What Daniel didn't know, what he was only now beginning to piece together through his own accountant, a man clearly unaccustomed to delivering news like this, was that I had spent 15 years quietly building a financial life of my own, separate and disciplined the same way I'd built everything else. Deployment pay that most people spend on nothing, in particular, I'd funneled into low-cost index funds. Housing allowances I hadn't needed since the house was already paid for. I'd redirected into a modest but growing portfolio of dividend stocks. 3 years earlier, I'd purchased a small rental property near the base, the kind of unglamorous 2-bedroom duplex that doesn't photograph well, but pays reliably every month. None of it was extravagant. None of it was hidden in the dramatic sense Daniel wanted to believe. It simply wasn't his, and he'd never once asked whether it existed. "You let me think we were struggling," he said during one particularly heated call, and I nearly laughed at the strangeness of the accusation, given that he was the one who'd walked into our kitchen with divorce papers and a girlfriend 3 weeks earlier. "I never told you we were struggling, Daniel," I said instead, keeping my voice level. "You told yourself a story about our life, and I let you keep believing it because it was easier than arguing with you about money every time I came home from deployment." The truth, when it finally settled over him, seemed to hit harder than the loss of the house itself. For 11 years, Daniel had operated under a quiet, comfortable assumption that he was the more capable partner in our marriage, the provider, the strategist, the one who understood money and status and how the world worked. He'd built his identity partly around that assumption, had made comments over the years, some careless, some pointed, about my paycheck being steady but modest compared to the deals he closed. He'd never asked what I did with the difference. Now he was discovering that the wife he'd considered financially unremarkable had quietly outbuilt him in nearly every measurable way without ever once needing his help or his permission. Vanessa's reaction when she learned the full scope of it was worse than Daniel's. She'd entered this relationship with a specific picture in mind: a successful executive, a valuable house, a lifestyle upgrade from her previous relationships. Watching that picture dissolve in real time, piece by piece, seemed to erode whatever patience she'd had left. The arguments between them grew louder and more frequent. A neighbor mentioned to me carefully, almost apologetically, that she'd heard raised voices coming from the house on more than one evening, Vanessa's voice sharper and more frequent than Daniel's. "You told me you had money," she reportedly said to him. "You told me she was just some soldier who'd be easy to walk over." Daniel, for his part, seemed to be discovering in real time that the woman he'd left me for had specific expectations about what their life together was supposed to look like. Expectations built on assumptions about wealth and stability that were rapidly proving false. Whatever affection had existed between them was buckling under the weight of financial disappointment, and I found I felt very little about that either way. I'd spent enough years compartmentalizing to know that other people's consequences weren't mine to carry. I focused instead on Emily, on keeping her routine steady, despite the upheaval: same bedtime, same breakfast, same walk to school when I could manage it around my schedule. She asked me once apropos of nothing why Daddy sounded so tired on the phone lately. Grown-up things. I told her, which wasn't a lie, just an incomplete truth, the kind you're allowed to offer an 8-year-old. What I didn't tell her was that her father was discovering in real time exactly how much of his identity had been borrowed from assumptions he'd never bothered to verify, and that the reckoning was only getting started. The courtroom was smaller than people expect, all beige walls and fluorescent light. Nothing like the dramatic wood-paneled rooms television trains you to imagine. I arrived early, as I do for everything, and chose to wear my Army service uniform rather than civilian clothes, not for effect, though I understood it would have one, but because it was simply who I was, and I'd spent enough of my life softening that fact for other people's comfort. Daniel arrived with Curtis, his attorney, both of them in expensive suits that looked slightly too new the way clothes look when they've been purchased specifically for an occasion, rather than worn into familiarity. Daniel's confidence had returned somewhat, by then rebuilt, through weeks of Curtis assuring him that a judge might still see things his way, that 11 years of marriage carried weight regardless of what a deed said. I understood the strategy. I simply didn't think it would work. Judge Rebecca Hill entered a few minutes past 9, reviewed the file in front of her with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen every version of this argument before, and looked up when she reached my paperwork. "Good morning, Colonel Carter," she said, and something in her tone told me she'd noticed the uniform, understood exactly what it represented, and respected it without needing to say so directly. The hearing moved through the preliminary matters, quickly custody arrangements for Emily, which Daniel's attorney barely contested given Emily's own clearly stated wishes, and then settled into the matter that had brought everyone into that room, the house. Curtis argued what he could, gesturing toward the length of the marriage, toward Daniel's financial contributions to the household over the years, toward a vague notion of fairness that didn't hold up particularly well against a title deed with a purchase date 8 months before our wedding. My attorney, a measured woman named Patricia Reyes, who'd handled military family law for over a decade, simply laid out the documentation. Purchase agreement, closing statement, mortgage payoff records, all in my name, all predating the marriage by nearly a year. It was as she'd told me from our very first meeting, about as clean a case as she'd ever seen. Then she called Margaret Lawson. I hadn't seen Margaret in years, not since the closing table where she'd handed me the keys to that house with tears in her eyes that I hadn't fully understood at the time. She walked to the stand slowly, using a cane now, but her voice was still sharp, still precise, the voice of a woman who'd spent 40 years practicing law before retiring to a quieter life. She explained when asked that she had owned the house before me, that she'd sold it directly privately without ever listing it on the open market. When Patricia asked her why, Margaret's answer settled over the courtroom in a way I hadn't expected. "I met Colonel Carter, Captain Carter, at the time through a program connecting veterans with housing opportunities," she said. She'd just come back from her 3rd deployment. She was exhausted in a way I recognized because my own late husband served 2 tours in Vietnam and came home carrying the same kind of tired. I decided I wanted to sell my house to someone who understood what it cost to serve this country, and I offered it to her well below market value because I believed she'd earned that consideration. I made sure every document was airtight in her name alone because I wanted her to have something in this world that no one could take from her. I hadn't known that last part. I felt something tighten in my chest, unexpected and unwelcome in a courtroom, and I kept my expression still the way I'd trained myself to for 2 decades. Daniel's face across the room had gone the color of old paper. Patricia asked a few more questions, confirming the timeline, confirming that Margaret had personally overseen every step of the sale specifically to ensure no ambiguity could ever arise about ownership. Curtis, to his credit, didn't waste much effort trying to shake her testimony. There was nothing to shake. An 80-year-old retired attorney with a paper trail that airtight isn't a witness you cross-examine into contradiction. Judge Hill didn't take long to rule. She noted, reading from her notes in the flat, unhurried cadence judges use when they know exactly what they think, that the house at 214 Ashford Lane was unambiguously separate property, purchased prior to the marriage, with documentation that left no room for the marital claim Daniel's attorney had attempted to construct. She granted the divorce-awarded primary custody of Emily to me with generous visitation for Daniel, contingent on consistency, and confirmed the house as solely mine, free of any claim from the marriage that had until 3 weeks ago existed inside its walls. Daniel didn't look at me as the ruling was read. He stared instead at some fixed point on the table in front of him. And I recognized the expression because I'd worn something like it myself once years earlier in a briefing room, where a mission I'd planned for months fell apart in a single sentence. I gathered my papers, nodded once to Margaret, who smiled at me with something like pride, and walked out of that courtroom into the parking lot where Emily was waiting with her grandmother, swinging her legs on a bench, utterly unaware that the last uncertain piece of our future had just been settled in a room she wasn't old enough to sit in. Daniel had 30 days to vacate the house per the judge's order, and he used nearly every one of them, moving boxes out in slow, reluctant trips that neighbors couldn't help but notice. I wasn't there for most of it. Patricia had arranged the logistics, so I didn't need to be, and I found I had no appetite for watching a man pack up the life he'd tried to take from me. There's no satisfaction in that kind of scene, only exhaustion, and I'd had enough of both to last a lifetime. Vanessa didn't wait for the 30 days. According to the same neighbor who'd kept me loosely informed throughout the ordeal, she left within a week of the ruling. Her boxes, the ones that had sat unpacked in the garage for over a month, still taped shut, still labeled in her handwriting, loaded into a moving truck by people who weren't Daniel. She didn't say goodbye to him in any way. The neighbor witnessed just direction to the movers and then gone. The relationship apparently unable to survive the discovery that the life she'd signed up for didn't exist the way she'd been promised. I heard secondhand and much later that she'd moved to another state entirely chasing some new version of the same ambition that had brought her into my kitchen with a smile on her face and someone else's house behind her. Daniel's professional life didn't fare much better. The real estate firm he worked for valued discretion and reputation above almost everything else, and a messy public divorce involving a decorated Army colonel, a mistress, and a courtroom testimony from an 80-year-old retired attorney had generated more attention in certain circles than his employers were comfortable with. I didn't orchestrate any of that. I never spoke to a journalist, never posted anything, never said a word beyond what the courtroom required. But small towns and small professional circles talk, and Daniel discovered that the version of himself he'd built, successful in control, admired, had been more fragile than he understood, dependent on a story that fell apart the moment enough people learned the truth of how it ended. I didn't take satisfaction in his losses the way I imagine some people would have. 22 years in uniform teaches you that revenge is rarely as clean as people imagine it, that the people who chase it usually end up carrying more weight than the people they aimed it at. I had Emily. I had the house paid for and secure with morning light that hit the kitchen table exactly the way it had the day Margaret Lawson handed me the keys. I didn't need Daniel's downfall to feel like I'd won anything because I'd stopped measuring my life against his the moment I walked out of that kitchen holding my daughter's hand. What I did insist on through Patricia was structure. Daniel could see Emily according to the schedule the court had set provided. He showed up consistently, provided he behaved like a father instead of a man performing fatherhood for an audience. I wasn't interested in punishing him by keeping Emily from him. Whatever he'd done to me, whatever he'd tried to take, none of it changed the fact that Emily loved him, and children shouldn't inherit their parents' battles as their own. Emily asked me about it one evening, weeks after the ruling, while we were unpacking the last of the boxes she'd brought back from the hotel. She was sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, arranging her stuffed animals back onto the shelf where they belonged when she looked up at me with the kind of directness only children manage. "Mom," She said, "Are we really okay? Like, actually okay?" I sat down on the floor beside her, the carpet cool beneath my hands, and thought about how to answer honestly without giving her more than an 8-year-old needed to carry. "We're finally free," I told her, and I felt the truth of it settle into my chest as I said it, solid and unshakable, in a way that surprised me. Not free from difficulty. Divorce doesn't work that way, and co-parenting with Daniel would require patience for years to come. But free from the version of our life that had required me to shrink myself, to let assumptions go uncorrected, to accept being underestimated as the price of peace in my own home. Emily nodded slowly, seeming to accept the answer at face value the way children often do, trusting the tone more than the specific words. She went back to arranging her stuffed rabbit on the shelf, adjusting it twice until it sat exactly right, and I watched her with a fullness in my chest that had nothing to do with rank or property, or any of the things Daniel and Vanessa had once tried to take from me. Outside, the last of the late afternoon light was slanting through the window in the same golden pattern I remembered from years earlier, the day Margaret Lawson had first shown me this house, and told me without quite explaining why that she thought it would make someone a very good home. She'd been right. It had just taken longer than either of us expected to become entirely mine. The first weekend after Daniel finished moving out, Emily and I painted her bedroom. It hadn't been part of any plan. I hadn't sat down and decided this was how we'd mark the beginning of whatever came next. But Emily had mentioned almost offhand that she wanted her walls to be a different color, something that felt like hers, instead of something that had simply always been there. We drove to the hardware store on a Saturday morning and let her choose from the paint chips, her small finger tracing over blues and yellows before settling on a soft, pale green that reminded me, though I didn't say so, of the color of new leaves in early spring. We spent the whole afternoon on it, drop cloths spread across the floor, Emily and one of my old army t-shirts 3 sizes too big, both of us, with paint on our hands and faces by the time we finished the first coat. She wasn't particularly good at staying inside the lines, and I found I didn't care. There was something in that unstructured, imperfect work rolling paint onto walls with my daughter, laughing when she flicked a brush too enthusiastically and caught my sleeve that felt more like home than anything I'd experienced in the 11 years I'd spent trying to make a marriage work in these same rooms. Word travels fast in a neighborhood like ours, and by the following weekend people had started stopping by. Not out of curiosity about the divorce, though. I'm sure some of that existed quietly beneath the surface, but out of something more generous, a kind of communal recognition that Emily and I were rebuilding something, and that rebuilding is easier with company. Neighbors brought over casseroles and spare furniture they no longer needed. A few of my old colleagues from the base, people who'd known me through deployments and promotions and the slow architecture of a military career, drove out on a Sunday afternoon to help me assemble a new bookshelf for the living room, the kind of practical, unglamorous support that means more than flowers ever could. Colonel David Morgan came by that same afternoon, still in the process of retiring after nearly 30 years of service himself, and stood in my newly rearranged living room with a level of pride on his face that I hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. "Some people think rank is earned on the battlefield," he said, looking around at the house, at Emily chasing the neighbor's dog across the backyard through the window, at the quiet, steady life I was building without anyone's permission. "Sometimes it's earned by surviving life with dignity." I didn't have a response for that right away. I've never been especially comfortable with praise, even after 2 decades of receiving commendations and medals and the formal recognitions that come with a long career. But something about the way he said it settled into me differently than any of those ceremonies ever had, because this wasn't about a mission completed under someone else's orders. This was about choosing deliberately and quietly to hold on to myself through something designed to strip that away. That evening, after everyone had gone home and Emily had fallen asleep exhausted from a day of running around with the neighbor's dog, I took the framed photo from my promotion ceremony, the one I'd been carrying home the day everything fell apart, and hung it in the hallway near the front door where I'd see it every time I came and went. Not as a trophy, not as proof of anything to anyone who might visit, just as a reminder to myself of what that day had actually meant. Underneath everything that happened after it, I understood something standing in that hallway that I hadn't fully grasped in the courtroom, or in the weeks of legal maneuvering, or even in the quiet satisfaction of watching Daniel's carefully built version of himself come apart under the weight of his own choices. The real victory hadn't been the house or the money, or even the vindication of watching people who'd underestimated me discover exactly how wrong they'd been. The real victory was smaller and steadier than any of that. It was Emily sleeping soundly upstairs in a green room she'd chosen herself. It was a home that finally fully belonged to the people who actually lived in it with honesty. Daniel sent a letter several months later, handwritten careful in a way that suggested multiple drafts. He apologized, not extensively, not in a way that excused anything, but sincerely enough that I believed he meant it. He said he understood now what he'd thrown away, and that he hoped someday to be the kind of father Emily deserved, even if he no longer had any claim to being the husband I'd once needed him to be. I didn't respond with anger. I didn't respond with warmth either. I wrote back 3 sentences thanking him for the honesty, confirming Emily's visitation schedule for the following month, and wishing him well in whatever came next for him. Some doors don't need to be slammed shut to stay closed. They just need to be left quietly, firmly in the past while you walk forward into whatever you're building instead. The day they told me to pack my bags, they thought they were taking my home. They never realized I had been carrying my real home beside me all along, holding my daughter's hand, all the way back to a house that had been mine before any of them ever walked through its door. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop a comment and let me know. We share stories like Elizabeth's every single day, the kind of quiet, hard-won victories that don't always make headlines, but deserve to be told, so subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. Let's keep walking through these journeys together.